craziest sex myths explained, from blue balls emergencies to medieval chastity belts that never existed. Some are hilarious, some are just plain harmful, and today we're diving right into all of them.
Think you really know the truth about sex? From blue balls to chasing cougars and being ready to go 24/7. Sounds legit, right? Well, it's not. In fact, almost everything you've heard is wrong. Time for a reality check. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, Sex Ed is in session. We're exposing the weirdest sex myths you have probably believed. Number 23. There are some couples who are way too comfortable oversharing. They'll drop well, we got quite a workout last night, followed by a wink at each other, while everyone else just groans or dry heaves. But sex doesn't actually burn that many calories. Experts believe that 30 minutes of sex burns anywhere between 90 and 120 calories, depending on the movement and weight. In comparison, 30 minutes on a treadmill will burn 200 to 500 calories on average. And let's be real, you're not having sex for 30 minutes. The average duration of actual intercourse is 3 to 7 minutes, meaning an average of 5, which means that you'll be burning 14 to 25 calories. Congratulations, you've earned half a grape.
What's wild is the myth of sex as a fat-burning machine goes way back. Victorian doctors literally prescribed it as exercise. Meanwhile, the Kama Sutra has positions that look more like CrossFit routines. Try the suspended Congress and tell me that's not core day. Honestly, sex is less treadmill, more Wii Sports, fun, slightly tiring, but nobody's getting a six-pack from it.
It might just feel like you're losing weight because of how sweaty you get, but sex isn't really a sport, nor does it affect sports, since Number 22. Coaches love to tell athletes to avoid sex 24 hours before a big game or a fight. It turns out they have no idea what they're talking about. In 2022, researchers ran a meta-analysis on studies linking sex and athletic performance. They found that sexual activity, whether 30 minutes or 24 hours before, had no impact on physical performance in young men. So where does this myth come from? Apparently, it comes from the ancient Greeks, who thought safeguarding a man's sperm would make him more aggressive in the arena. Today, it's present in a slightly different way. As boxing trainer Jim McDonnell says, it's an old-school thing in boxing, an old wives' tale that sex makes the legs go weak and that you can't take a punch on the chin. Since science hasn't found any link between leg strength and when you last had sex, it's safe to say that myth is all talk and no thrust. Number 21. Some people still believe that you can't get pregnant during your period. Not only is that wrong, it's exactly how a lot of budgets get wrecked. One minute you're having safe sex, and then the next you're feeding and clothing a surprise human for the next 18 years. This myth is a result of people confusing unlikely with impossible. Sure, it is unlikely that you'll get pregnant during your period, but it's also unlikely that Pete Davidson would date some of the hottest women on the planet. But here we are.
Shots fired, and honestly, the whole sex ruins athletic performance thing feels like the ancient Greek version of don't swim after eating. They thought conserving sperm made you fight harder. Basically, Dragon Ball Z power-ups, but grosser. Modern science? Nope, no wobbly legs, no weak chin. If anything, a good pre-game session probably helps you relax before stepping in the ring. Imagine telling Mike Tyson, sorry champ, no action tonight, your jab might suffer. Yeah, good luck with that conversation.
Women with shorter periods, closer to 21 days instead of 28, start ovulating earlier in their cycle. And since sperm can live in the woman for up to 5 days, it could still fertilize an egg by the time ovulation starts. Not to mention, women's cycles don't always operate like clockwork. Periods can often come early, come late, or get completely thrown off. But it's hardly the only myth about sex and pregnancy. Number 20. Trying to get that baby out? Have sex. It's such a common myth that even some doctors recommend it to women who have passed their due date, mostly to those who are totally done lugging around the human equivalent of a watermelon. But science doesn't support this recommendation at all. One study in the Journal of Sexual Medicine looked at the data for thousands of women in 3 trials. It turns out women who had sex went into labor at the same rate as those who didn't. This myth likely also comes from the fact that orgasms release oxytocin, which causes uterine contractions, and also semen has something called prostaglandins in it, which softens the cervix. If both happen at the same time, contractions and an open cervix, it makes sense that labor would be more likely. But this hypothesis hasn't been successfully shown to work. Number 19. It's a classic sitcom trope. A group of young people working, dating, and somehow affording a massive apartment in the city, and at some point the young guy starts dating an older woman. Despite the age gap, it works because, as he proudly declares, we're both at our sexual peak. People started believing this myth because of Alfred Kinsey's work in the 50s. The famous sexologist found that those having the most frequent orgasms were 18-year-old men and 35-year-old women. So he deduced that this was when those two groups were at their sexual peak. So what was really going on? Well, 18-year-old men were having the most orgasms, not because of amazing sex, but because their testosterone was peaking, and they were going solo a lot. Meanwhile, 18-year-old women weren't having nearly as many, mostly because their partners were 18-year-old men. On the flip side, women in their mid-30s were more likely to be in stable, trusting relationships, meaning better sex, more confidence, and more orgasms.
It's actually very dumb. So basically, Kinsey's men peak at 18, women at 35 stat is the reason every sitcom thought it was hilarious to pair a frat boy with a divorcee. In reality, it wasn't sexual peak, it was masturbation Olympics on one side and relationship stability on the other. Fun fact, the whole older women equals better lovers idea shows up way earlier. Roman poets like Ovid literally hyped it up 2,000 years ago, and honestly, they weren't wrong. Teenage boys are still losing to Wi-Fi and Doritos.
Sex drives in general are pretty fluid, and they go up and down a lot through everyone's life, regardless of gender. There's no real peak, though libido generally is the highest for both genders in their late teens and 20s, and it declines bit by bit after. Number 18. Having a little difficulty raising the mainsail? You could always bite on some dark chocolate or get a plate of oysters to set the mood. They are the perfect aphrodisiacs, right? Wrong. No studies back up any connection between oysters and chocolate and sex drive. Chocolate has a small lowering effect on blood pressure, which can enhance blood flow to the entire body, including the fun parts, but no study has ever shown that all it takes to make you a stud is a Hershey's bar. Well, what about other aphrodisiacs? There has to be something to get you in the mood, right? Besides Pedro Pascal, it turns out that there isn't much that's been proven to work as a libido booster yet. UC Irvine professor of obstetrics and gynecology, Dr. Michael Kreikman, says that preliminary studies of ginkgo, ginseng, maca, and tribulus have shown some promise, but are still either too conflicting or too small scale to show anything definitive. But maybe finding aphrodisiacs doesn't matter because… Number 17. There's a common misconception that men are always ready for sex, and honestly, no myth does more damage to both sides. Men feel guilty when they're not in the mood because they're expected to always be, and women can feel rejected or heartbroken when a man who is supposed to want it doesn't. In fact, one 2010 review of multiple sex studies found that 14% to 19% of men regularly said they had problematic low sexual desire, at least for them. Robin Milhausen, an associate professor at the University of Guelph, studied the sexual expectations, mindsets, and experiences of male and female undergrads. She found that the belief that men are always ready for sex sets impossible standards for men to live up to. The stereotype is so pervasive that when men didn't want to have sex, both genders assumed that there was something wrong with them. Men doubted themselves, and their female partners got self-conscious for not being able to get them in the mood. Relationship therapist Sarah Hunter Murray interviewed men about their sexual desire for her book. She was surprised to hear that men said that if they felt an emotional disconnect from their partner, they might not be in the mood to have sex. So sex is about a lot more than pure robotic animal instinct for men, which is why it is doubtful this next belief is untrue.
That whole men are always ready myth is basically the Fast and Furious franchise of stereotypes, loud, overhyped, and running way past its expiration date. Reality check. About 1 in 5 men report low desire, and not because of broken machinery, but things like stress or emotional disconnect. Wild idea, right? Turns out men aren't vending machines where you insert hugs and outpops sex. Sometimes the real aphrodisiac is not feeling like a human Wi-Fi router that's always on.
Number 16. The idea that men always want sex more than women is a lazy myth. It ignores the real messy individual differences that actually shape desire. In fact, multiple studies on the topic have reached very different conclusions, partly because cultural gender roles and social stigma make it hard to collect reliable data. Men and women don't always feel equally comfortable sharing information about their sex drive or partners, which muddies up the picture even more. Psychologist Julius Frankenbach completed one meta-analysis of multiple studies that found men on average have higher sex drives than women, But there was such a wide variability in sex drive in both genders that this just didn't say anything specific about man or woman. For example, over 1/3 of the women in the study had a higher sex drive than the average man, and this is just in studies that don't take social perceptions into account. That's why a study in the Archives of Sexual Behavior tried to eliminate the factors that would make a woman feel judged for choosing to have sex. When that happened, they found that men and women were almost equally likely to agree to meet up with prospective partners for the possibility of sex. Number 15. The claim that men and women are just genetically different when it comes to sex is completely false. In reality, studies on sexual differences are hard to interpret because cultural pressure makes women feel less likely to be open about their sex drive or number of partners. So what looks like a biological difference might just be a reporting gap. One 2007 study tried to test this by dividing male and female participants into groups. One group was told their answers would be seen by their peers. This would elicit the most socially acceptable answer. Another group was told they would be double-checked by a lie detector to elicit the truest answer. When men and women thought that their peers would see their answers, men reported masturbating much more frequently, but the lie detector group reported the same rates. In the groups that thought their peers would see their answer, men reported 3.7 sexual partners and women 2.6. In the lie detector group, this changed to 4.4 for men and 4.0 for women.
That's actually very interesting. So the whole men are wired for more sex line kind of collapses once you add a lie detector. Suddenly those gender gaps shrink faster than a cold shower. Fun twist, when women don't feel judged, their willingness to say yes to casual hookups matches men's almost perfectly. So maybe it's not DNA, just decades of double standards dressed up as science.
Number 14. The idea that uncircumcised men are somehow less clean is prevalent in cultures where circumcision is common. This myth might come from the fact that uncircumcised boys have a slightly higher risk of urinary tract infections. In boys under 2, the UTI rate is about 2.7 per 100 person years if they're uncircumcised, compared to just 0.6 in circumcised boys. But that's not a reflection of cleanliness. In the early 2010s, Vice asked a bunch of people in the US what they thought about cut and uncut penises. One person said, "It's cleaner and healthier to be circumcised." Another said that uncircumcised guys get dirt trapped in their flaps. If a guy doesn't practice good hygiene, bacteria, oil, and dead skin cells can build up under the foreskin, leading to something called smegma. That's not because the guy is uncircumcised, it's because he won't clean himself. Number 13. Is it frustrating when you're aroused but you don't end up having sex with someone? Sure. But is it a horrifically painful experience that needs to be attended to immediately? No, it's generally temporarily uncomfortable and it goes away after a few minutes. Blue balls, or epididymal hypertension, is an uncomfortable but harmless sensation that can happen when someone stays aroused for a long time without release. And there is actually a female equivalent, blue vulva. But you rarely hear women say that they need sex right away because their blue vulva is killing them. That's because the whole blue balls thing has mostly been used as a guilt trip, a way to pressure women into sex they don't want.
The funniest part about blue balls is how it became a full-blown bargaining chip, when medically it's just blood hanging around a little too long. You know what else does that? Sneezing fits. Nobody's guilting people into sex over hay fever. And here's a twist. Victorian doctors once claimed pent-up seed caused hysteria in men. Translation: dudes have been rebranding minor inconveniences as life-or-death crises for centuries.
Number 12. Speaking of myths about men and sex, can we finally retire the idea that men think about sex every 7 seconds? If that were true, the average guy would clock over 8,000 sexual thoughts a day. That's not a libido, it's a full-time job. Honestly, guys probably spend more time thinking about how they would heroically save everyone at a 7-Eleven if a knife-wielding maniac burst in, or whether a lion could beat a shark if sharks could walk on the land, than they do thinking about sex. In 2011, a study in the Journal of Sex Research debunked this myth. Scientists found that men think about sex on average about 19 times a day, or less than once per hour. About as much as they thought about food, 18 times a day. Women thought about sex 10 times a day and food 15 times a day. So when women say food can be better than sex, we guess they really mean it sometimes. Not that women don't have their own harmful stereotypes when it comes to sex. Number 11. The idea that it takes longer to turn women on comes from one simple truth. For most of human history, a lot of men didn't really care if the woman they were with was turned on or even finished. And let's be honest, half of them couldn't find the clitoris if there was a flashing neon arrow pointing right at it. Way back in 2007, a study published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine decided to test the sexual response times of men and women. They used thermal imaging to measure genital blood flow, super sexy, in men and women who viewed a series of videos, either neutral, funny, or erotic. The study found that men's and women's genitals reached their highest temperature, peak arousal time, after the same amount of time had elapsed. We assume of the erotic one, not the funny one. Number 10. It's hard to believe that there are still people in 2025 who believe an intact hymen is a good indicator of virginity. Let's be clear, an intact hymen or the absence of a hymen doesn't say much about a woman's virginity. The hymen has one function, and one function only, to stop fluid from entering the vaginal canal when a girl is a baby, and it hasn't yet mastered the concept of sitting down to go to the bathroom. Past toddler age, the hymen is useless. In fact, it's so useless that many women lose it or at least tear it way before their first sexual experience, through physical activity, accidents, using tampons, etc. Surprisingly enough, hymens can also sometimes stay intact after a woman's first sexual experiences. Hymens are often just a ring-like structure around the entrance that can stay exactly where it is after sex. One study by Rogers and Stark even found that up to 19% of sexually active women had no visible changes to their hymen.
That men think about sex every 7 seconds would make half the workforce unemployable. Imagine surgeons zoning out mid-operation because it's that time again. The real number, about 19 thoughts a day, is more like how often people check the fridge hoping food magically appeared. And the hymen as virginity test? Total junk science. It's basically biological bubble wrap, useful only when you're a baby. After that, it can tear from biking, gymnastics, even sneezing too hard. Crazy.
Number 9. The idea that women get loose from many partners has always been used as a way to shame sexually active women. And it's not remotely true. It's not like men's penises get smaller from having too much sex either. Women are born with different pelvic and vaginal structures. The only thing that can change those structures, besides an accident of some kind, is damage during the process of giving birth. Because a whole tiny human is going through a hole the size of a bagel, and that can mess some things up. But even after childbirth, though they take a while to recover, the stretched vaginal muscles will slowly heal. So if a baby doesn't end up making a huge difference in how stretched a woman's vagina is, it's unlikely that Mike from the corner bar will do any worse. Number 8. Sex doesn't necessarily hurt when people do it for the first time, but there are a few reasons it might. First is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So many women are told their first time will hurt that they end up tense and nervous during the process. That means they aren't relaxed and lubricated enough to enjoy the sex, so it hurts. On average, people in the US will lose their virginity at about 17. It's roughly the same age in the rest of the world, and really, 17-year-olds, they just aren't that great at sex. So when you combine nervousness with two people who have little to no idea about foreplay or what they're doing in general, yes, it can cause pain. But if both partners take their time and relax, it's way less likely that your first time will be a painful experience.
The first time always hurts idea is like a spoiler that ruins the whole movie. You go intense, bracing for pain, and surprise, tension causes the pain. Add two 17-year-olds with the combined skill set of a YouTube tutorial, and yeah, things won't feel great. But studies show when people relax and actually focus on foreplay, pain isn't inevitable. It's less biology, more bad expectations, plus awkward teenage fumbling.
Number 7. In addition, bleeding doesn't always occur during a woman's first experience of sexual intercourse either. In fact, women only bled during their first time 43% of the time, making those olden-day rituals in which a newlywed couple had to show their bloody sheets both disgusting and pointless. Bleeding is usually caused by the hymen tearing or stretching. But as we've already explained, the hymen might already be broken before a woman's first sexual experience of intercourse, or it might remain intact for her first few times having sex. And hey, speaking of stupid ideas people have about their first time. Number 6. You can't get pregnant your first time? Trust us, you absolutely can. We have no idea why this is something people believe. But of all the myths, this is a pretty damaging one, because inexperienced teens who barely understand sexual health or pregnancy are probably the last people who should be having kids they didn't plan for. According to sex columnist Dan Savage, this myth persists mostly due to a lack of good sex education in public schools. This is especially true in the US, which has the highest teen pregnancy rate of the developed world. A 2012 study by the CDC found that of teens who had unprotected sex and became pregnant, 31.4% of them didn't think it was possible. The researchers didn't follow up on all the specific reasons they thought this, probably because they were too busy banging their heads against the nearest desk. But the fact that only 48% of teen girls and 45% of teen boys from 2015 to 2019 received instruction about birth control in school is probably relevant.
That whole "you can't get pregnant the first time" myth is the sex ed equivalent of believing quicksand is a daily threat. Spoiler, you absolutely can, and plenty do, hence the teen pregnancy stats. The CDC literally found a third of pregnant teens didn't even think it was possible. That's less biology fail, more education fail. Unbelievable crazy.
Number 5. Speaking of ill-advised methods of birth control, pulling out coupled with no other form of contraception is not a great way to prevent pregnancy, as many couples find out the hard way. It's better than nothing. In fact, if you use the pull-out method perfectly, you only have a 4% chance of getting pregnant, but almost no one uses it perfectly. Timing can be off, people can finish early, just to name a couple of reasons. Not to mention, pre-ejaculate fluid can contain sperm, and that is not protected against at all with the pull-out method. So in real life, 22% of people who use withdrawal end up pregnant, which are not the best odds. Not to mention, it does almost nothing to prevent your risk of getting an STD. There are definitely better methods of contraception, and some have been around forever.
I'm guilty, guys. Have done it before. The pull-out method is basically the floppy disk of contraception. Technically worked once, but why are we still trusting it in 2025? Sure, perfect use gives a 4% failure rate, but in the real world, people have lag spikes. That's why the number jumps to 22%. And fun fact, condoms have existed for centuries. Ancient Egyptians used linen sheaths, and the Romans tried animal bladders. Withdrawal, meanwhile, has stayed equally unreliable since the Bronze Age.
Number 4. Contraception is not a recent invention. The first mention of a condom dates back to 3000 BC in Crete, specifically used by King Minos. Actual evidence of condoms were found in Tutankhamun's tomb by archaeologist Howard Carter, dated to 1350 BC. It was made of linen soaked in olive oil, attached to a string that tied around the pharaoh's waist. People from medieval times also used condoms, but they were slightly different than the ones we have today because they were made of sheep bladders. We'll give you a moment to get rid of that mental image. In ancient Greek and Roman times, there was an herb called Silphion. It had medicinal and culinary uses. Even Hippocrates himself recommended it as birth control. Other authors also recommended it to control the menses, which was often ancient code for birth control. Well, the Romans and Greeks used this herb so much it became extinct. So clearly people were getting it on quite a bit, and as safely as they could thousands of years ago. But you know what sexual device we associate with history that wasn't actually used? Number 3. For a long time, people believed that in the medieval era, men made their wives wear chastity belts. Only the husband had the key, so while he was off at war or sailing the seas, he could be sure his wife stayed faithful, while he was probably being a lot less faithful all across Europe. But the only reference historians have found to anything like a chastity belt in medieval literature is metaphorical, except for one 1405 manuscript called Belli Fortis, which includes a whole chastity belt design. But that book is clearly meant to be satirical, as it also has designs for things like devices that make you invisible. This makes the existence of a real chastity belt less likely, unless people in the Middle Ages also had Harry Potter-like invisibility cloaks that we are unaware of. The Victorians, who were obsessed with medieval ages, brought chastity belts into existence as an actual design for the first time, but they still weren't really used. Speaking of inaccurate ideas of historical people's sex lives. Number 2. Turns out the Puritans weren't so pure. They actually rebelled against the Catholic Church's teachings that sex should only be done for procreation. Instead, they thought that sex should be an important part of general married life. Leland Ryken, the author of an in-depth book on Puritans, noted that when a New England wife complained first to her pastor and then to the whole congregation that her husband was neglecting their sex life, the church proceeded to excommunicate the man. Imagine not being in the mood for a couple of months because you're stressed, and then your wife tells everyone at church. Next thing you know, you're kicked out of your friend group. Not to mention, historical estimates put the number of Puritan women who were pregnant on their wedding date somewhere between 30 and 40%. That doesn't make them much of an exception for their time, though. Since, number 1, it's often believed that for centuries women in the past were virgins on their wedding day. And while virginity was definitely prized among the upper class of Western Europe, for most people things were very different. It was still valued for working and middle-class women to be virgins for sure. But there was also an understanding that once a couple was together, they were probably getting busy. After all, the big reason upper-class women were expected to stay virgins was money. If they had sex outside of marriage, it could jeopardize inheritances, since a husband might end up raising a child that wasn't his own. But working-class women didn't have much for their children to inherit anyway. This is reflected in a study that looked at marriage and birth records during the 18th century in rural England. Of 49% of brides that could be traced to birth records in the same parish, 1/3 were recorded as giving birth within 8.5 months of their wedding. Using additional records to track down missing data, researchers concluded that in rural England, anywhere from 1/6 to 1/3 of brides were already pregnant on their wedding day. Considering that most sexual encounters don't end in pregnancy, we can't even imagine how many times those couples had sex before heading to the altar. If you thought these myths were strange, just wait until you hear the real stories. Check out weirdest sex customs around the world and see how bizarre human traditions can truly get, or click on this video instead.
So, turns out history's purity was mostly just creative PR. From linen condoms in King Tut's tomb to Puritans getting church canceled for not putting out, the truth is way juicier and funnier than the myths. Even the whole virgin bride story crumbles once you check parish records. Spoiler, a lot of shotgun weddings. Honestly, sex myths tell you more about social control than biology. Big props to Infographics Show for turning awkward dinner table taboos into binge-worthy trivia. Links in the description. As for what's next, let's just say things are about to get weird in ways you don't expect. Stay nerdy.